I'm now excited to introduce Gabriel Blanco Gomez. Gabriel Blanco is a PhD student in neuroscience at McGill University, specializing in language processing in the brain. Fueled by a passion for learning new languages, his research integrates data from linguistics, neuroscience, and genetics to investigate language development in children with autism and other neurodevelopmental disorders. His work has been recognized in Canada and internationally, winning various awards, including the Joan and Warren Chippendale Award from the Montreal Neurological Institute and a fellowship with the Canadian Neurodevelopmental Research Training Platform. Gabriel's mission is to improve clinical practices for children with language disorders and uncover the mysteries of human language evolution. Without further ado, please welcome Gabriel to the stage for his talk, The 3 Things Your Brain Does to Understand This Sentence.
Language is amazing. Let me show you. I want you to close your eyes and picture this. There's a blue capybara in the middle of the Amazon forest singing an opera as it flies away on its tiny, tiny wings. I can guarantee you that you have never heard that sentence before, but because I can say it, you can imagine it. And that's what makes language so powerful. Unlike other species, human language is not bound by context. You don't have to have something in front of us to be able to talk about it. We can talk about things that are abstract, like democracy or philosophy or how it feels to be sad. We also know that language is universal. We can find it even in the most isolated places on Earth. Where there's a human settlement, chances are you have communication and language. But have you ever stopped to think how we do that? How is it that your brains can understand every word that I am saying right now? This is a question that really, really excites me. And hopefully today I can give you some insights based on all the research I've done throughout the years. So when we want to answer a question about language, we really have to go back to where it all starts: babies. We know that by 6 months of age, a child can already tell you the difference between vowels and just random noise. By 12 months, they can start saying single words, and soon after that, sentences. But we can't exactly ask babies how they learn language. What we can do, however, is we can look at their brain activity using something like this. So this that you see on the screen, that's an EEG, or a system that measures tiny changes in electrical activity generated by their brain, allowing researchers and neuroscientists like me to look at different brain dynamics as they develop. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to know if we could use an EEG to track and see different changes in your brain that can predict language. So to answer that, my colleagues at Seattle Children's Hospital in the US and at Birkbeck, University of London in the UK, ran a study of over 150 babies where they did EEG at 6 months, and then they tracked their development for the next 3 years. And this is what they found. So we found that what you can see here is we have age on the x-axis and language ability on the y-axis. And you can see that over time, babies tend to get better at language. But we can also see sort of 2 groups that are forming at the same time. So we could have a group called the early talkers, here in red, which are kids that, for them, language is easy. It develops quickly, they can reach milestones earlier. But then we also have a second group. These are kids in blue, what we can call late talkers, or ones that have more difficulties, or they're more likely to experience language delays. But as I mentioned earlier, we had access to EEG data at 6 months. So what I wanted to know for my project, I wanted to know if there was any way that we can use that brain dynamics information to predict some of these trajectories. So when we looked at the data, I was able to find that for you or for language to occur, you generally need 3 things. The first thing is something that we call lateralization. Let me explain to you. I don't know if you've ever looked at a human brain, but it looks something a little bit like this. So you have 2 hemispheres that look pretty much identical, or at least anatomically speaking, but they seem to be doing different functions. So when I say a word like hello audience, all of those words are transferred through the air as vibrations. They reach your eardrums. they're transformed into electrical activity, and then that information gets sent to your left hemisphere. Now, the job of the left hemisphere is to know meaning. For instance, is this a word that I know? Or is it in a grammar that makes sense? Or a language that I understand? And while your left hemisphere is doing this, your right hemisphere is doing something completely different. It's paying attention to things like intonation or prosody. Is this person talking really fast? Is it a question that they asked me, or was it more of a statement? Were they sad or like very happy when they said this particular statement? And it's this ability to have two hemispheres that are working separately, yet together, that we call lateralization. And what we found was that babies that had highly lateralized brains, or brains that were really good at multitasking, were the ones that were more likely to develop language early. But not only do you need a brain that's able to do this, it also needs to know when to activate, which brings me to point number 2. The second thing that your brain needs for language are what we call gamma rhythms. So ever since the first EEG was done by psychiatrist Hans Berger in 1904, we have known that the brain activates at very specific rhythms or frequencies. So some frequencies are more predominant when you're focused, concentrated, or paying attention. And then some of them are more predominant where you're asleep, for example. But the ones that we were interested in are what we call gamma rhythms. And the interesting about gamma rhythms is that they seem to keep the balance between excitation, or periods where there's a lot of activity in your brain, and inhibition, periods where there's a lot less activity going on. You can think of it as almost like a conductor in an orchestra. So if your brain is a symphony, for example, you need a conductor that can tell you to go a little bit faster or to slow down a little bit more. And what we found was that babies that had too much of these gamma rhythms, or a brain that was going too much or too fast, were more likely to see language deficits. Now, the last or the third thing that you need for language, and probably the most important one, is something that we call connectivity. So if I go back to this brain here, you can see that it's divided into very specific regions, which we can think of as sort of like processing centers. So near the back of your brain, you have your visual cortex, which processes images. You have your auditory cortex closer to the middle, and its job is to process sounds. But you also have highly specialized regions, like, for example, your inferior frontal gyrus, whose job is to do language production or talking. And then you have other regions that are more associated with things like language comprehension. Now, the really interesting thing about an EEG is that we can actually see when some of these regions or processing centers are talking to each other by measuring how often they activate at the exact same time. And when we looked at the brains of babies, we saw that kids or infants that had lots of connections between the language processing centers, the talking centers, and the auditory centers were a lot more likely to have language earlier. However, if your auditory cortex was too active or sending lots of signals at the same time, you were more likely to have language deficits, which is intuitive, right? If you have this auditory cortex that it's activated every time you hear a sound, then you're more likely to feel overwhelmed or overstimulated. And you're less likely to be able to tell the difference between irrelevant sounds versus important information. But one thing that we also found interesting in this study was that babies at this age already had lots of connections or connectivity from their talking regions, which is unusual because these are 6-month-olds. They don't talk yet. So what we think could be happening here is that they're building the associations between sounds and articulatory movements. I'm going to give you a little test right now. Hope you guys are awake. In about 3 seconds, I'm about to show you an object. And I want you to just say out loud what that object is as soon as you see it. You guys ready? Okay. 3, 2, 1. Okay, most of you have the linguistic capacities of a 1-year-old. Not everyone, though. I heard a couple people that were quiet. And I know it doesn't sound very cool, but let me tell you, it's very impressive. When I show you that object, many parts of your brain activated at the exact same time. Your visual cortex was like, oh, I know that. That's red. It's round. It's an apple. Your auditory cortex was like, hey, I know those sounds. A, P, L, E. Your language comprehension center was like, hey, that is a fruit. It's healthy. It keeps the doctors away. But more importantly, your language production or your talking centers knew how to pronounce this particular object. They send signals. They told your mouth to open up when you say an A, to put your lips together for a P, and to put your tongue close to the roof of your mouth to say an L. And let me tell you guys, you did that like this, in milliseconds. But that's because you're an adult. You have lots of experience. Pretty sure you've seen apples before. You've eaten apples, so you have lots of these connections between so many of these different association centers. But as a baby, you don't have many of these just yet. So you need to build them, and you do that through practice. There was a very interesting study that came out from the University of British Columbia by Dr. Choi that actually showed this quite brilliantly. So in this study, what they did is they had babies at around 6 months of age, and they showed them 2 separate sounds. So they had sounds in English and in Hindi. And unsurprisingly, the babies could tell the difference between the 2 languages. And we know this because we can see the changes in the EEG brain activity. But what they did next was very clever. They brought the same babies to the lab again, but this time they gave them a teething toy that essentially restricted their mouth movements. And what they found was that once the babies couldn't move their tongues or their mouth, suddenly they had a really hard time telling the difference between the 2 sounds. Why? Because they're building the associations between sounds and movements. So when you hear a baby go like ba ba ba, da da, gu gu ta ta, that's not random. That it's them trying to build the associations between the sounds that they hear, the words the world that they see, and the articulatory movements to create or pronounce some of those sounds. Your brain did that very quickly, but babies need to learn how to do that. And they do a really good job. So I started this whole talk by saying a sentence that no one else had said in the world today. And your brain was able to create a mental picture of that blue capybara. And it did that because of 3 things. 1, you had lateralization, so 2 hemispheres that could work separately on different objects and different processes, but were working together at the same time. 2, you had gamma rhythms, or a nice balance between lots of excitation and lots of inhibition, or less activity in the brain. And then number 3, you also had lots of connectivity, or there was a lot of communication between your visual centers, your auditory centers, and your language centers as well. But understanding how all of this works is only one small part of the puzzle. In fact, our role as researchers is not only to gather knowledge about the world that we see, but also figure out how to use that knowledge to make a difference. Which is why a large portion of our studies focus on children with autism. Why autism, you may ask? Well, I'm going to give you one last analogy today. I want you to picture this. You need to reply to a very important email from your boss, but as soon as you begin to type, you realize that some of the keys in your keyboard are not working. You panic and you frantically try to come up with a message, but you can't. Frustrating, right? Well, this is similar to the reality that many children with autism face every single day. Sometimes they want to communicate and they want to express their thoughts, but the keys in their brain or some of these different dynamics are not responding how we would expect them to. Now, it's not all bad. There are many therapies out there for children that have language deficits, but here's the catch. Every child with autism is different, which means that they have their own unique brains, their own unique keyboards, with their own unique challenges. So what might be some therapies that could be useful for some kids might actually not work very well for others. So what can we do? Well, this is where something like an EEG or an MRI could be potentially very useful. Because if we can understand what's going on in their brains or in their keyboards, whether that means knowing that they have an overactive auditory cortex that gets them overstimulated, or a gamma conductor that's going a little bit too quickly, then maybe, and just maybe, we can match them to better specialized interventions. We have known for the last 2 decades that interventions work. But we also know that for them to be more effective, they have to start very early. So as scientists and as a society, we need to make sure that families have earlier access to resources, better access to personalized interventions, and schools that are better equipped with resources to match individual needs. Because at the end of the day, every child deserves a chance to tell their own stories. A chance to have their wildest dreams and ideas be able to put into words that the world can understand. Even if those wild thoughts are about blue capybaras flying through the Amazon forest. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ben. I'm a program creation coordinator with TEDxMcGill. Gabriel, that was simply fantastic. I just have one question for you. After learning about how babies learn and develop around language, what's one thing that surprised you the most about how active they are in learning?
I think I'm just never felt to be amazed at how quickly they do it. Like, before they can even walk, before they can even learn to clean themselves up, they're already learning languages. And not just one. I haven't even touched the idea of bilingualism. Like a baby can understand not just one language, not even 2, sometimes 3 and more. And even children with autism that sometimes struggle with different auditory deficits, sometimes they can still learn multiple languages. So I don't know, if you have a nephew or a little baby out there, they're pretty cool. They're doing a lot of crazy stuff right now.
Thank you so much, Gabriel. Thank you so much.
Thank you.